A trust framework is an important concept that, it's a complicated term for what might otherwise feel like a pretty simple concept. Anytime we use an identity system, it's a trust framework. It's a system that's allowing us to create trust around some particular institution or individual. So when you log in somewhere, right, you're essentially answering the trust question, prove to me that you are the individual who was here last time with the same username and password. And so that's one kind of trust transaction. When we use a credit card, it's the same kind of thing. It's more sophisticated because there are actually multiple domains involved. But Visa has created a trust framework, right, a set of business processes, legal rules, and technology that allow my bank to believe that they're going to get paid when I accept a credit card from someone that is at a completely different financial institution. And so that framework is what allows them to have that trust, to believe that that transaction will be valid. The world is full of trust frameworks. We use them all the time. When we get a mortgage, for example, all of the rules and regulations and things that we have to do. I mean, to someone getting a mortgage, it's just a never-ending stream of questions and documents and other things. But to the people who are using those documents, they're essentially establishing this evidence that they can believe all of the data they need to believe. And so that's one example. Well, as I mentioned, an authentication system is a different example of a trust framework. Amazon's authentication system is different than, say, the bank's authentication system because they're answering different trust questions. At some level, the authentication question is generic enough that we all believe we can use, we can buy systems from vendors and solve that problem. But every institution customizes those for the specific trust problems that they're trying to solve. In the old days, right, hundreds of years ago, even now to some extent, when you go to the market and you're interacting with somebody who you know, you're establishing trust based on local information. Who you know, who they know. I've known John forever. He's a good butcher. I'm going to go there and get my hamburger. Whatever is important to me. But there came a time when people had to start trusting strangers. In order to trust strangers, what they did was they built institutions. So banks are an example of an institution which is built for transferring trust between strangers. I don't have to know you in order to conduct business with you. And commerce rests on this idea of institutions that have centralized this kind of trust phenomenon. These trust institutions, like governments, universities, banks, allow different people from different parts of society to interact with each other without having to know each other, without even having to know anything about each other. Now, the problem we've gotten into in the modern world is we've centralized trust, but that doesn't really work very well online. And so online, what we're faced with is a bunch of individual institutions that we interact with that don't know anything about each other. So it's very hard for us to kind of pull them all together. What we're trying to do with distributed ledger identity systems like Sovereign is to create a decentralized identity system that allows trust to be transferred between individuals and between institutions without having to have the central authorities in the way. Offline, people are the conveyors of their own trust credentials. So when I walk into the pharmacy and they want to know that I'm over 18 in order to fulfill my prescription, I give them a driver's license. Now, a driver's license wasn't built to work in pharmacies. It's built to administer driving privileges. And yet we use it outside of its original domain in order to establish the veracity of certain attributes, like my age or my address. The reason that works is because of two important ideas. The first is we all believe that the Driver's License Bureau does a reasonable job of verifying attributes, like your age, right? The second thing is they've packaged all of that information into a container that's pretty hard to forge. Hard enough to forge that it's useful for establishing your age at the pharmacy. And so that's a very useful idea because what that means is the pharmacy doesn't have to have the Driver's License Bureau's permission. They don't have to do an integration. There aren't any APIs that they have to interact with in order to validate that I'm over 18. They can just do that. They can just decide one day, hey, we're going to start checking driver's licenses, and the next day start doing it, and it all works. We need to build those same kind of systems online so that we can allow people to be the conveyors of their own trust credentials. And what that does is it creates a much more flexible system than we have today, and one that's much less costly because we don't have to do integrations. And it's not just about saving cost, that's important, but it's also, I believe, the fact that there are lots of business cases that don't get built because the integration is too costly. Whereas if we had a really flexible, already integrated way of doing something, we would just use it. The internet was the same kind of thing for communication. There are lots of new use cases for communication because people don't have to build their own communication system anymore. Right? What we get with Sovereign is a system where people don't have to build their own trust frameworks anymore. There are over 1 billion people in the world who are either undocumented or underdocumented, meaning they don't have any kind of government-issued ID. As a result, it makes it very difficult for them to interact with systems like healthcare systems and education systems and other things that are all kind of built on this idea that we would have some sort of universal person registration. So one of our partners called iRespond. They're an NGO, and what they do is they do vaccinations in Africa and Asia. They're using Sovereign and this idea of a distributed ledger identity to be able to keep track of the immunizations that people have had. Because the reason you want to keep track of them is because it can be dangerous to give people the same immunization twice or to give certain immunizations within certain time frames of each other. So by keeping track of them, they not only keep them safe, but also can be much more promiscuous in how often they vaccinate because they can look at the record and say, oh yeah, that person needs this, so let's give it to them right now while they're here.